Blood tastes like old pennies and regret. When the open palm connected with Beatrice's jaw, the ballroom didn't gasp. They just stopped chewing their overpriced canapes. A mistress hitting the wife was messy, publicly messy. But as Beatrice touched her bleeding lip, feeling the heat of hundreds of staring eyes, she didn't cry. She just realized, with a cold, terrifying clarity, that her decade of playing the quiet, invisible wife was officially over. Ringing filled her left ear, a high, thin whine like a dying fluorescent tube. The physical pain was secondary to the sheer, disorienting shock of the impact. It wasn't a movie slap, perfectly choreographed and clean. It was clumsy. The heel of Sylvia's hand had caught the edge of Beatrice's cheekbone, while the manicured fingernails scraped a jagged line down toward her chin. Beatrice stood there, her cheap satin dress clinging awkwardly to her hips, the fabric suddenly feeling like sandpaper against her sweating skin. The air in the Grand Hotel's ballroom was thick with the cloying scent of roasted tenderloin, melting ice sculptures, and Sylvia's perfume, an aggressive wave of jasmine and synthetic vanilla that made Beatrice want to gag. Sylvia was panting. Her chest, poured into a custom emerald gown, heaved up and down. Her hand hovered in the air between them, trembling slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe she had actually thrown the strike. "Stop looking at me like that," Sylvia hissed, her voice vibrating with a frantic, unearned righteousness. "Stop acting like you didn't know. You're pathetic." Beatrice didn't look at Sylvia. She looked past her, over the padded shoulder of the mistress, straight at her husband. Dominic stood 3 feet away, clutching a crystal champagne flute so tightly his knuckles were bloodless. He looked like a mannequin someone had bumped into and left teetering on its base. He smelled of expensive vetiver and nervous, sour sweat. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again. A fish suffocating on expensive carpet. He did absolutely nothing. No defense, no outrage. Not even a hand raised to calm the woman he had been sleeping with for 8 months. He just stared at Beatrice's bleeding lip, terrified that the scene would derail his impending promotion to regional director. That was the worst part. The sheer, overwhelming mediocrity of it all. Beatrice hadn't married a monster. She had married a coward. She touched her split lip with the pad of her thumb. It came away smeared with bright, wet red. She rubbed the blood between her thumb and forefinger, feeling its tacky texture. She wasn't heartbroken. The love had drained out of their marriage years ago, leaking through the cracks of unpaid bills, passive-aggressive sighs over burnt toast, and Dominic's endless, hollow corporate ambitions. No, she wasn't heartbroken. She was utterly, profoundly exhausted. And she was angry, not a fiery, screaming rage. It was a cold, dense mass settling in the pit of her stomach, heavy as lead. "You're right," Beatrice said. Her voice was raspy, surprisingly steady. It didn't echo in the cavernous room, but in the dead silence of the staring crowd, it carried. "I did know." Sylvia flinched, the aggressive posture faltering for a fraction of a second. Dominic finally managed to choke out a sound. Please, let's go out to the hall. Don't make a scene." "Don't make a scene." Beatrice looked down at her scuffed black pumps. She had bought them on clearance 4 years ago. She had spent a decade shrinking herself, folding her edges to fit into Dominic's small, suburban life. She had clipped coupons, ironed his pale blue dress shirts, and smiled politely at his condescending bosses. She had traded a life of terrifying, crushing power for the illusion of safety, and this was her reward, say, a public slap from an event coordinator who drank too much Prosecco. Without another word, Beatrice turned. She didn't storm out. She didn't run. She walked with deliberate, heavy steps across the plush carpet. The crowd parted for her like water, eyes averted, pretending to examine the floral centerpieces or the bottoms of their drinks. The silence stretched until she hit the heavy oak double doors. She pushed them open, stepping out of the stifling heat of the gala and into the cool, sterile air of the hotel lobby. The valet gave her a strange look as she walked out the revolving glass doors and into the biting November wind. She didn't wait for a cab. She just started walking down the concrete sidewalk, the city lights smearing in her peripheral vision. The cold air stung her scraped cheek. It felt good. It felt real. For 10 years, she had pretended to be Beatrice Cole, the mild-mannered librarian, the supportive wife. She had buried her maiden name so deep, she almost forgot how to spell it. She stopped under a flickering street lamp. The bulb hummed, casting a sickly yellow light over the wet pavement. She pulled her phone from her tiny clutch. Her screen was cracked in the corner. She bypassed her contacts, pulling up the dial pad. Her fingers hovered over the glass. She hadn't dialed this number in 10 years. She had memorized it the day she ran away, promising herself she would rather starve in the gutter than crawl back to the suffocating, toxic empire her family had built. Beatrice tasted the blood on her lip again. She thought of Dominic's empty, terrified eyes. She thought of the 40-hour work weeks she endured just to make sure their mortgage was paid, so Dominic could buy his ridiculous imported suits. She punched in the 11 digits. International code first. It rang twice. A click. Then, a voice as dry and ancient as dust. Operations. Authorization required. Beatrice closed her eyes. The wind whipped her hair across her face, sticking to the drying blood. "It's Beatrice," she said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping back into a cadence she hadn't used since she was 22. "Beatrice Gallagher." A pause on the line, a sharp intake of breath. Then, the dry voice returned, trembling slightly. "Miss Gallagher, where are you?" "I need a car," Beatrice said, staring down at her cheap, scuffed shoes. "And I need Alistair. Tell him the sabbatical is over." Rain started to fall, thin and freezing, pricking her bare shoulders through the flimsy fabric of her coat. Beatrice didn't move. She stood beneath the sputtering street lamp, feeling the dampness seep into the seams of her clearance rack dress. The phone felt heavy in her hand, a solid brick of finalized decisions. 10 minutes later, the sleek, obscenely long profile of a black Maybach slid against the curb, its tires hissing softly on the wet asphalt. It looked like an alien spaceship amidst the line of dented sedans and yellow cabs. The rear door clicked open instantly. Beatrice slid into the cabin. The transition from the freezing street to the interior was jarring. The air inside smelled of rich, unblemished leather, ozone, and faint peppermint. It was completely, terrifyingly silent, the outside world deadened by inches of armored glass. A man sat in the forward-facing seat across from her. Alistair. He hadn't changed. He still wore the same bespoke charcoal suits, still had the same shock of thinning white hair, and still possessed eyes that looked like chips of wet slate. He didn't smile. He just stared at the angry red mark spreading across her pale cheek. "Someone," Alistair said softly, his voice a low rumble over the purr of the engine, "is going to have a very short lifespan." Beatrice reached up, touching her cheek. "It's nothing, Alistair. Just a reminder of how the other half lives." "The other half," Alistair mused, pulling a pristine linen handkerchief from his breast pocket and offering it to her. "You mean the ordinary people you so desperately wanted to join?" Beatrice took the handkerchief. It was monogrammed. She pressed it to her split lip. "I was tired of the war, Alistair. I just wanted quiet." "And did you find it?" he asked, tapping a polished fingernail against the leather armrest. 10 years playing house with a mid-level accounts manager. 10 years eating synthetic food and worrying about electrical bills. Tell me, Beatrice, was the quiet worth it? She closed her eyes, letting the smooth motion of the car rock her. She pictured her small, cramped kitchen, the smell of Dominic's burnt coffee, the way the floorboards squeaked near the sink, The endless, mind-numbing conversations about his office politics, his petty rivalries, his desperate need to impress men who wouldn't spit on him if he were on fire. No, she admitted softly. The word tasted bitter. It was suffocating. The Gallagher blood doesn't do well in captivity, Alistair said simply. He opened a sleek compartment between the seats, withdrawing a thick leather folio. He laid it on his lap. Your grandfather passed away 3 months ago, Beatrice. Her eyes snapped open. She felt a bizarre twinge in her chest. Not grief, precisely, but the unsettling sensation of a massive load-bearing pillar suddenly vanishing from her world. The old tyrant was dead. The man who had ruthlessly built the Gallagher Group into a trillion-dollar conglomerate, crushing rivals and family members alike, was gone. Who has the board? She asked, the old instincts, the ones she had spent a decade suppressing, flaring up instantly. They are fighting over scraps, Alistair sneered, his lip curling. Your cousins are tearing the company apart, selling off divisions, making deals with private equity. They think you're dead, or at least entirely out of the picture. He tapped the folio. But your grandfather, for all his monstrous qualities, wasn't an idiot. He left the controlling shares, 51%, in a blind trust, only to be unlocked if you came back. Beatrice stared at the folio. It looked like a bomb waiting to go off. And if I didn't? Then, upon your documented death, it goes to charity. He would rather give it to stray dogs than let your cousins run his empire into the ground. Alistair leaned forward, the smell of peppermint growing stronger. Sign the papers, Beatrice. The moment your pen leaves the page, you are the majority shareholder of the Gallagher Group. Real estate, tech infrastructure, global shipping, media. It all bends to you. She looked out the tinted window. They were driving past the financial district. Giant glass towers, piercing the low-hanging clouds. 10 years ago, she had run from this because she knew what power did to people. She had seen her father drink himself to death from the stress. She had seen her mother become a hollow shell of jewels and prescription pills. She had chosen Dominic because he was simple. He was safe, but safety was an illusion. Dominic hadn't protected her. He had used her as a prop for his own pathetic climb. And when it became inconvenient, he let her get struck in public. She turned back to Alistair. Dominic works for a firm called Apex Solutions. They're a subsidiary. Alistair didn't even need to check a device. Apex Solutions, acquired by Gallagher Logistics 4 years ago, a microscopic blip on our balance sheet. We own them entirely. Beatrice felt a smile pull at the corner of her mouth. The split lip stung, sharp and bright. Give me the pen. Alistair handed her a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. The metal was cool against her skin. She flipped open the folio. The legal jargon blurred together, but she didn't need to read it. She knew the devil she was making a deal with. It was her own family. She pressed the nib to the thick, cream-colored paper. The scratch of the metal was loud in the silent cabin. She signed her full name, Beatrice Eleanor Gallagher. It felt like slipping into a suit of armor that was 2 sizes too tight and lined with thorns. Welcome back, Miss Gallagher, Alistair said, taking the folio and snapping it shut. The sound was like a gunshot. What are your first orders? Beatrice looked at her reflection in the dark glass. She looked messy. Her hair was damp, her makeup smeared, her cheek red and swollen. But her eyes, they were cold. They were Gallagher eyes. I need a hotel room. Not the one I was just at, she said, her voice flattening into a boardroom monotone. Tomorrow morning I want the CEO of Apex Solutions in my office. The real office, not the subsidiary branches. And I want a full audit on Dominic Cole's accounts. Every expense, every bonus, every corporate card swipe he's made for the last 3 years. Hunting for irregularities? Alistair asked, a grim smile playing on his lips. He's sloppy, Beatrice said, leaning her head back against the leather. He thinks he's brilliant, but he's sloppy. He's been taking his mistress to 5-star hotels. On his salary, With our mortgage, the math doesn't work. He's expensing it. If he is stealing from the company, he's stealing from me, Beatrice corrected quietly. And I want to watch him realize it. The air in the executive suite of the Gallagher Tower smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and money. It was a subtle, intimidating scent. The room was 50 floors above the city, a sprawling expanse of dark mahogany, brushed steel, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked down upon the financial district, like a hawk eyeing a field of mice. Beatrice sat behind the massive oak desk. She wasn't wearing her clearance rack dress anymore. A tailor had been summoned to her hotel room at 3 a.m. She was now encased in a sharply cut ash-gray blazer and trousers that cost more than Dominic's car. Her hair was pulled back tight. The swelling on her cheek had gone down, leaving a faint, yellowish bruise that she hadn't bothered to cover with makeup. Let them see it. It was 9 a.m. The heavy double doors opened and Alistair stepped in, followed by a sweating pale man in a rumpled suit. This was Gregory Vance, no Gregory Hale, the CEO of Apex Solutions. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. He had been yanked out of bed at dawn by corporate security and dragged to the headquarters of the parent company, a place he had only ever seen in promotional brochures. Hale stood awkwardly in front of the desk, his eyes darting around the cavernous office before finally landing on Beatrice. He blinked, confusion warring with terror. He didn't recognize her. Why would he? To him, she was just the quiet wife of one of his mid-level managers. "Mr. Hale," Beatrice said. Her voice didn't echo. It was soft, requiring him to strain slightly to hear it. A classic power play her grandfather had taught her when she was 12. Force them to lean into your space. Yes. Good morning. I apologize, I was not informed who I was meeting with," Hale stammered, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. Beatrice ignored his apology. She picked up a thick stack of papers on her desk. The audit Alistair's team had worked through the night. "Apex Solutions," Beatrice began, flipping to the second page. "Your quarterly margins are stagnant, your employee retention is abysmal, and your middle management is apparently using corporate accounts as a personal slush fund." Hale bristled slightly, defensive instinct briefly overriding his fear. "I assure you, ma'am, our financial oversight is rigorous. We run a tight ship at Apex." Beatrice didn't look up. "Dominic Cole, Regional Management Track, Employee ID 88492. Hale frowned. "Cole? Yes, he's one of our solid performers. In fact, we were just discussing him for a promotion to Regional Director. His numbers are good." "His numbers are fraudulent," Beatrice stated flatly. She slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany. It came to rest right at the edge of the desk. Hale hesitated, then stepped forward and picked it up. His eyes scanned the document. It was an itemized list of expenses spanning 8 months. High-end dinners, weekend stays at boutique hotels, jewelry receipts listed under client retention gifts. This is a lot of client entertainment," Hale said weakly. "The client he was entertaining," Beatrice said, leaning back in her chair and steepling her fingers, "was Sylvia Rossi, your event coordinator. Is Miss Rossi a high-value client, Mr. Hale?" Hale's face drained of whatever color was left. He stared at the paper, his mouth working silently. "No, she is an employee. If this is true, this is gross embezzlement. I had no idea if—" "Of course you didn't. You are incompetent," Beatrice said. She didn't raise her voice. She delivered the insult as a simple statement of fact. "Which brings me to my next point. You are going to fire him." "Yes, absolutely, immediately. I will have HR draft the paperwork." "No," Beatrice interrupted, her eyes locking onto his. "You are not going to send an HR email. You are going to do it in person, today, at noon, in the middle of the open plan office." Hale swallowed hard. "A public termination. That opens us up to litigation, ma'am. We usually handle these things quietly." "Mr. Hale," Alistair spoke up from the corner of the room, his dry voice slicing through the air. "Oh, you seem to be under the impression this is a negotiation. The woman sitting before you is Beatrice Gallagher. She owns the building you are standing in. She owns the company you work for. She owns the debt on your second home in the Hamptons. You will do exactly as she says, or by 1 o'clock, you will be joining Mr. Cole in the unemployment line." Hale physically recoiled, his eyes widening as he looked at Beatrice again. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Gallagher, the ghost heir. I understand, Miss Gallagher," Hale whispered. "Good," Beatrice said, standing up. She walked around the desk. Her expensive heels made sharp, rhythmic clicks against the hardwood floor. She stopped right in front of Hale. "You will fire him publicly. You will list embezzlement as the cause, ensuring he will never work in this industry again. And then, you will fire Sylvia Rossi for complicity." She watched Hale nod frantically, his breathing shallow. "One more thing," Beatrice added, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She reached out and tapped the lapel of Hale's suit. "When Dominic asks who authorized the audit, you tell him it came from the top. You tell him the new majority shareholder requested it personally. And if he asks who that is," Hale choked out. Beatrice smiled. It was a terrifying expression. The bruise on her cheek seemed to darken in the morning light. Oh, he won't have to ask. I'll be there to watch him pack his desk." She turned away, walking back to the window to look down at the crawling traffic below. "You are dismissed, Mr. Hale. Don't be late." As the heavy doors clicked shut behind the terrified CEO, Beatrice felt a strange sensation in her hands. They were trembling, not from fear but from the adrenaline. It was a potent, intoxicating drug. She had spent a decade suppressing the Gallagher ruthlessness, convinced she was better than her bloodline. But as she imagined Dominic's face, the panic, the humiliation, the utter destruction of his tiny, pathetic kingdom, she realized a dark truth. She was her grandfather's granddaughter, after all, and she was going to enjoy this. Apex Solutions was a monument to corporate mediocrity. The walls were a color officially designated as oatmeal, the carpets a slightly darker, stain-hiding gray. The air constantly smelled of burnt filter coffee, overheated photocopiers, and the faint, sour tang of collective anxiety. It was an environment designed to grind human ambition into dust, but to Dominic, it was a kingdom. He sat in his glass-walled cubicle, a status symbol he had fought bitterly for, leaning back in a mesh, ergonomic chair. He was laughing too loudly at a joke made by a junior analyst. His tie was loosened just enough to suggest he was hard at work, his sleeves rolled up to expose his forearms. He looked entirely undisturbed by the events of the previous night. The slap, the blood, Beatrice walking out, it had all bounced off his impenetrable narcissistic armor. He assumed she had gone to her sister's house to cry. He assumed she would be back by Sunday, cooking a roast and apologizing for embarrassing him. Beatrice stood by the frosted glass of the elevator bank, 70 feet away. She was a ghost in her own life, watching the terrarium from the outside. The tailored ash-gray blazer felt heavy on her shoulders. Her bruised cheek throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache keeping time with her pulse. She watched Hale, the CEO, emerge from the carpeted hallway. He looked as though he were walking to the gallows. His face was chalky, his suit suddenly looking a size too big. Two broad-shouldered men from corporate security flanked him. The low hum of the open plan office began to die. It started near the copy machines and rippled outward, a wave of silence following the CEO's heavy footsteps. Keyboards stopped clattering. Heads popped over cubicle dividers like meerkats sensing a predator. Hale stopped directly in front of Dominic's glass box. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open. Dominic's laughter died in his throat. He sat up, hastily attempting to straighten his tie. "Mr. Hale, I wasn't expecting—" "Pack your personal items, Dominic," Hale said, His voice was supposed to project authority, but it squeaked, tight, with residual terror from his morning meeting. Dominic blinked. The junior analyst slowly backed out of the cubicle, melting into the crowd of staring employees. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Are we moving me to the corner office early?" "You are being terminated, effective immediately," Hale said, reading off a single piece of paper with trembling hands. "The charge is gross embezzlement, misuse of corporate funds, and fraudulent expense reporting." The word embezzlement dropped into the silent office like a cinder block on a glass table. "Embezzlement," Dominic's voice cracked. His face went through a rapid succession of colors, pale white, blotchy red, then a sickly, grayish yellow. He stood up, knocking his knee against his desk. The dull thud echoed. "That's insane. This is a mistake. I entertain clients. My margins are the best in the region." "Your receipts for the past 8 months have been audited," Hale said, his eyes darting nervously toward the elevator bank, though he couldn't see Beatrice through the frosted glass. "The St. Regis, the jewelers, all for an employee. Not a client." A choked sob cut through the quiet. Sylvia. She was standing by the break room, clutching a stack of manila folders to her chest. Her face, usually heavily contoured and defiant, was crumpled in absolute horror. Hale turned to her. "Miss Rossi, security will escort you to your desk as well. You are also terminated for complicity in corporate fraud." Dominic lunged forward, grabbing the edge of Hale's sleeve. It was a pathetic, desperate gesture. "Listen to me, Greg. Please, we can fix this. I'll pay it back. I'll take a pay cut. I have a mortgage. I have a wife." Beatrice pushed the frosted glass door open. The heavy hinges let out a soft hiss. She walked down the center aisle. Her heels clicked against the thin carpet. It was a sharp, predatory sound. The employees parted, pressing themselves against their desks. They didn't know who she was, but they recognized the cut of the suit, the straightness of her spine, and the sheer, unadulterated coldness radiating from her. Dominic looked up, his eyes locked onto her. For 3 full seconds, his brain refused to process the visual information. He saw the bruise on her cheek first. Then he saw the suit. Then he saw the absolute deadness in her eyes. "B," he whispered. The words sounded absurd in the silence of the office. Beatrice stopped 6 feet away. The smell of Dominic's fear, sweat reached her, sharp, metallic, and pathetic. "Your wife," Beatrice said, her voice smooth and even, "is filing for divorce, and your mortgage is going into default by the end of the month." Dominic's jaw slackened. He looked from Beatrice to Hale, and then back again. The gears in his head were grinding, trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. What are you doing here? Did you do this? B.A. Did you call HR? Are you crazy?" "I didn't call HR, Dominic," she replied, tilting her head slightly. She looked at the cheap plastic nameplate on his desk. Dominic Cole, senior manager. She reached out, picked it up, and dropped it into the small metal trash can by his chair. It hit the bottom with a hollow clatter. "Then who authorized this?" Dominic yelled, his panic finally curdling into anger. "Who audited me?" Hale cleared his throat. He stepped back, gesturing awkwardly toward Beatrice. He looked like a man introducing a bomb to a room full of hostages. "The audit was requested by the parent company's majority shareholder, Miss Beatrice Gallagher." Dominic froze. His eyes widened, the pupils contracting to pinpricks. He stared at her face, the structure of her cheekbones, the color of her hair. He knew her maiden name was Gallagher, but he had thought it was a coincidence, a common name. She was a librarian. She drove a used Honda. "You," he breathed out, the syllable trembling. Beatrice didn't smile. There was no joy in this, just the necessary mechanical clearing of debris. "Enjoy the cardboard box, Dominic. Security, make sure he doesn't take company staplers. He has a habit of taking things that don't belong to him." She turned her back on him and walked toward the elevators. She didn't look back when the screaming started, nor when the sound of Sylvia's hysterical crying echoed down the hallway. The apartment smelled exactly the way she knew it would. Cheap lavender plug-in air fresheners fighting a losing battle against the damp smell of aging brick and the lingering grease from Tuesday's pan-fried chicken. For 10 years, this smell had meant home. Now it just smelled like a cage she had finally outgrown. Beatrice stood in the center of the cramped living room. The ugly, overstuffed brown sofa sat against the wall, bearing the permanent indentation of Dominic's body, where he watched sports on Sundays. The television, which he had insisted on buying on credit, loomed too large for the small space. 3 men in dark suits, provided by Alistair, were moving through the apartment with terrifying efficiency. They weren't packing everything, they had specific instructions. Only the books Beatrice had brought into the marriage. Only her clothes. The few pieces of cheap jewelry she had bought herself. Everything else, the furniture, the appliances, the matching plates they received as wedding gifts, stayed. She didn't want a single atom of this life clinging to her. "Miss Gallagher," one of the men said, stepping out of the bedroom carrying a single leather duffel bag. "That is the last of it. We left the husband's belongings entirely untouched." "Thank you, David," Beatrice said. She ran a finger over the dusty laminate surface of the kitchen counter. Her finger came away gray. How many hours had she spent scrubbing this counter, trying to make the cheap material shine? The sound of keys frantically scratching against the front door lock broke the quiet. The handle rattled violently. Then the door flew open, slamming against the drywall and leaving a dent. Dominic stood in the doorway. He was a mess. His tie was gone, his shirt was untucked, and a dark, wet stain of sweat bloomed under his arms. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically around the room, taking in the men in suits, the single packed bag by the door, and finally, Beatrice. "What is this?" he demanded, stepping into the room. The false bravado was gone. He sounded shrill. "What the hell is going on, Bae? I just got escorted out of my own building by armed guards." "You were escorted out of my building," Beatrice corrected him mildly. She didn't move from the kitchen counter. Dominic let out a harsh, barking laugh. It sounded like tearing metal. "Your building? Have you lost your mind? You're a librarian. You clip coupons for laundry detergent." He took a step toward her, his face twisting into something ugly and mean. "You went to Hale, didn't you? You made up some psychotic lie because you were jealous of Sylvia. You ruined my life over a stupid misunderstanding." David, the security man, took a smooth, silent half-step forward, placing himself between Dominic and Beatrice. Dominic bumped into the man's chest and stumbled back, suddenly realizing he was outmatched in every conceivable way. "Dominic," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the stale air. "Do you remember when we met? You asked me about my family. I told you they were complicated, and that I didn't speak to them." "So what?" Dominic spat, wiping sweat from his forehead. My grandfather was William Gallagher, founder of the Gallagher Group." Beatrice watched his face carefully. She wanted to see the exact moment his reality fractured permanently. "When I left 10 years ago, I walked away from a $40 billion trust because I wanted a normal life. I wanted a quiet, decent man." She stepped around the counter, closing the distance between them. She stopped just out of arm's reach. "I bought this illusion," she continued, her tone dropping, becoming intimate and deadly. "I paid for it with my youth, my patience, and my absolute submission to your mediocre dreams. I washed your socks, I smiled at your terrible bosses, and all I asked for in return was basic, foundational loyalty." Dominic was shaking his head, backing away slowly. No, that's impossible. If you were a billionaire, why did we struggle? Why did we have to save up for 3 years to go to Mexico?" "Because that was the life you could afford," she stated simply. "And I wanted to live in your reality. But you couldn't even manage that." She gestured to the bruised cheek. "You let her hit me. You stood there holding your champagne, and you calculated the risk to your promotion, and you decided I wasn't worth defending." "Bae, I was shocked. I didn't know what to do." Dominic pleaded, his voice breaking into a whine. He reached out, trying to grab her hand. David slapped his wrist away with enough force to make Dominic yelp. "The lease on this apartment expires on the 30th, Beatrice said, ignoring his outburst. She walked toward the front door. "Since you no longer have an income and your corporate accounts are frozen pending a criminal investigation, I suggest you start packing. The landlord has already been notified." "You can't do this," Dominic screamed, his face red and contorted. "You're my wife. Half of everything you have is mine." Beatrice paused in the doorway. She turned her head, looking at him over her shoulder. The lighting in the hallway cast sharp shadows across her face, highlighting the bruise and the cold, unyielding lines of her jaw. "We signed a prenup the week before we got married, Dominic. You didn't read it. You just saw the $50,000 payout clause in the event of a divorce and signed it because $50,000 was the most money you'd ever seen in your life." She stepped out into the hall. "Keep the $50,000, she said softly. "You're going to need it for the embezzlement lawyers." She didn't close the door. She just walked down the hallway, the heavy footsteps of her security detail echoing behind her, leaving Dominic standing alone in an apartment that smelled like cheap lavender and ruin. The air in the Gallagher Group boardroom on the 52nd floor was thick. It wasn't physical heat, but the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of predatory wealth. The room smelled of polished mahogany, old paper, and Camilla's aggressive metallic rose perfume. Preston Gallagher sat at the far end of the sprawling table, lazily spinning a gold, heavy-barreled pen between his manicured fingers. He smelled faintly of gin and tonic, though it was barely 2 in the afternoon. Beside him sat Camilla, her sharp, angular face pinched in irritation, tapping a manicured nail rhythmically against the glass screen of her tablet. Surrounding them were 6 board members, old men in dark suits who had survived her grandfather's reign by being exceedingly quiet and exceptionally vicious. "The logistics division is bleeding us," Preston drawled, his voice a slow, aristocratic purr. "The private equity offer from Vanguard is more than generous. We liquidate the shipping lanes, keep the real estate, and distribute the dividends. It's clean." "It's a fire sale, Preston, and you know it," Camilla snapped, though her eyes betrayed a hungry gleam. She stood to make $500 million off the backdoor commission. But given the lack of leadership, since the old man finally choked on his own venom, it's the only play we have. Alistair, standing quietly in the corner by the double doors, checked his pocket watch. It clicked shut loudly. "We haven't held a formal vote," an older board member grumbled, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "We don't need a formal vote," Preston sighed, sitting up and flattening his tie. "I control 20%. Camilla has 15%. The rest of you hold fractions. We sell." The heavy mahogany doors didn't swing open. They were pushed open, violently, rebounding off the rubber stoppers with a sound like a thunderclap. The room jumped. Preston dropped his gold pen. It clattered against the table, rolling off the edge and hitting the thick rug. Beatrice walked in. She didn't look like the ghost who had left 10 years ago. She didn't look like the bleeding woman on the sidewalk. She looked like a weapon that had finally been unsheathed. She wore a black wool coat draped over her shoulders like a cape, the ash-gray suit underneath sharply tailored. The bruise on her cheek was a dark, yellow-purple smudge, a badge of violence she refused to conceal. She walked the length of the room. Her heels sank into the plush carpet, muffling her steps, making her approach seem predatory and silent. She didn't look at the board members. She kept her eyes locked on Preston. "What is this?" Camilla demanded, her voice shrill, standing up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood border of the floor. "Beatrice, what the hell are you doing here?" "Security." Alistair stepped forward from the corner, his presence suddenly filling the room. "Security answers to the majority shareholder, Camilla. I suggest you sit down." Beatrice reached the head of the table, the empty chair that had belonged to her grandfather. She didn't sit in it. She placed her hands on the high leather back, leaning forward slightly. "Hello, Preston," Beatrice said, Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of the emotional static that usually filled boardrooms. "You look tired." Preston's face was the color of old parchment. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing. "You're dead. The private investigators said you were dead. Your investigators are incompetent, much like your financial projections," Beatrice said. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a thick, black flash drive. She tossed it onto the polished wood. It slid to a halt, right in front of Preston. "What is that?" Preston whispered. "That," Beatrice said, tracing the stitching on the leather chair, "is the complete record of the shadow accounts you've been running through the Cayman Islands for the past 3 years. You've been skimming off the top of the tech division to fund your gambling debts in Macau." Preston flinched as if he had been struck. The board members shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting away. She turned her gaze to Camilla. The metallic rose perfume suddenly smelled sickeningly sweet, like rotting flowers. "And Camilla," Beatrice continued, her tone softening into something that sounded almost sympathetic, which was far worse than anger. "Vanguard Private Equity isn't buying the logistics division because it's bleeding. They're buying it because you promised them the port contracts in exchange for a seat on their board. A blatant breach of fiduciary duty. A felony, actually." Camilla's mouth worked silently. Her hand gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were bone-white. "You can't prove that. You've been gone a decade. You're a nobody." Beatrice finally pulled the leather chair back and sat down. The leather creaked loudly in the dead silence of the room. She folded her hands on the table. "Alistair," Beatrice said without looking away from her cousins. "The documents have already been filed with the SEC, Miss Gallagher." Alistair's dry voice echoed from the corner. "And copies have been sent to the Justice Department, pending your final authorization to unseal them." The air went out of the room. The board members, sharks who had survived decades of blood in the water, suddenly realized they were trapped in a tank with a leviathan. "I hold 51% of the voting shares," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low, rhythmic cadence. "I own the building. I own the boats. I own the servers. And as of 3 minutes ago, I own both of you." She leaned forward, locking eyes with Preston, who was now sweating profusely. "The logistics division is not for sale," Beatrice commanded. The room vibrated with the finality of the statement. "Preston, you are resigning your position on the board, effective immediately, citing health reasons. Camilla, you are taking a leave of absence to focus on philanthropy. Yoaki, if either of you utter a single word to the press, I will authorize Alistair to unseal those files, and you will both spend the next 20 years wearing orange jumpsuits." Preston stared at the black flash drive on the table. He looked entirely broken. The unearned arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only a terrified, pathetic man. He nodded once, a jerky, spasmodic movement. Camilla didn't nod. She just stared at Beatrice, tears of pure, impotent rage pooling in her eyes. But she sat down. Beatrice looked around the table at the remaining board members. They were holding their breath. "The sabbatical is over," Beatrice announced to the quiet room. She touched the bruise on her cheek, feeling the lingering sting of her old life finally fading away. "Now, let's get to work." Ruin is rarely an explosion. It is usually a slow, bureaucratic leak. For Dominic, it started at a gas station pump on a Tuesday afternoon. He shoved his Visa into the machine, shivering in a thin windbreaker. The screen blinked, paused, and spat out a terse message. "Card declined. Contact issuer." He swore, his breath pluming in the cold air, and tried his MasterCard. Declined. He tried the joint checking debit card. Declined. He stood there staring at the pixelated screen, the smell of gasoline sharp in his nostrils, feeling a cold knot of genuine terror form in his gut. He had $32 in his wallet. His phone, which had been ringing non-stop with collections calls from Apex Solutions' legal department, vibrated again against his thigh. He didn't answer it. Across the city, sitting in the penthouse suite of the Gallagher Tower, Beatrice was eating a piece of dry toast. It tasted like sawdust. The suite was cavernous, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a god's-eye view of the congested arteries of the city below. The air was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of expensive ozone and fresh lilies that housekeeping replaced twice a day. It was entirely, oppressively silent. She stared at the iPad resting on the marble island, a live feed of Dominic's financial accounts, legally frozen under the injunction Alistair had filed. She watched the red numbers blink. The mortgage default. The overdraft fees piling up like dry leaves. She rubbed her jaw. The swelling was gone, leaving a sickly, mottled yellow stain across her cheek. The physical pain had faded, but a strange, hollow ache had settled in her chest. This was the contradiction of vengeance. She had expected to feel a soaring, triumphant high. Instead, she just felt tired. The sheer amount of energy it took to dismantle a human life was exhausting. Alistair entered the kitchen. He moved without making a sound, a ghost in a bespoke suit. He set a thick manila envelope on the marble counter next to her toast. "The depositions are set for tomorrow morning," Alistair said, his voice flat. "The Apex legal team has a watertight case. Mr. Cole has retained counsel." Beatrice took a sip of her black coffee. It was too bitter, coating the back of her throat. Who did he hire? A strip mall firm, Alistair noted, a faint sneer touching his lips. Personal injury mostly. They demanded a retainer of $10,000. He paid it by liquidating the small retirement account he started before you were married. It's all he had left. And when they see the evidence, they will advise him to plead guilty to avoid prison time, and they will keep the $10,000. Alistair replied smoothly. He poured himself a glass of sparkling water. "He is attempting to contact you. 7 voicemails on the dummy line we set up." Beatrice picked up her phone. She opened the audio files. She didn't put them on speaker. She pressed the cold glass to her ear. First voicemail. "B, please. You have to call off the lawyers. I can't access my money. I can't buy food. Please, we can talk about this. I'm sorry." His voice was thick, desperate. Fourth voicemail. "You psychotic bitch, you planned this. You trapped me. I'll go to the press. I'll tell them the heir to the Gallagher fortune is a vindictive insane." It cut off in a fit of coughing. Seventh voicemail. Just the sound of wet, rhythmic breathing, followed by a quiet, broken sob. Beatrice lowered the phone. She felt a phantom weight on her ring finger, where her cheap, cubic zirconia wedding band used to sit. She had flushed it down the toilet of a 5-star restaurant 3 days ago. Do you want me to block the number?" Alistair asked, watching her face closely. He was a man who understood the mechanics of power, but human emotion was an unpredictable variable he constantly monitored. "No," Beatrice said softly, staring out at the gray, weeping clouds over the city. "Let him leave them. He spent 10 years talking over me. It's only fair I let him speak to a machine." She pushed the dry toast away. The hunger was gone, replaced by a cold, metallic resolve. She had wanted to be normal. She had tried desperately to mold herself into the shape of a forgiving, supportive wife, but normal people got slapped in public and went home to cry in cheap apartments. Gallaghers didn't cry. They bought the building, fired the staff, and changed the locks. "Prepare the car for tomorrow morning, Alistair," Beatrice said, standing up and pulling her silk robe tighter around her waist. "I want to be in the room when he realizes he has absolutely nothing left." The conference room at the Gallagher Legal Annex was designed to intimidate. There were no windows. The walls were paneled in dark, suffocating walnut, and the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, headache-inducing frequency. The air smelled of bitter coffee grounds and the faint, chemical tang of whiteboard markers. Beatrice sat at the head of the long, polished table. She wore a tailored black suit that felt like armor, her hair pulled back into a severe, unforgiving knot. To her right sat Thomas, the lead litigator for the Gallagher Group, a man with eyes like flat, black pebbles. The heavy door opened and Dominic walked in. He looked as though he had aged 5 years in a single week. His suit, once a point of arrogant pride, was wrinkled and smelled faintly of stale sweat and cheap gin. His face was puffy, his eyes bloodshot and darting frantically around the room. He didn't look at Beatrice. He looked at the floor, dragging out a chair on the opposite side of the table. His cheap lawyer, a balding man with a shiny polyester tie, sat beside him, already sweating. 2 minutes later, Sylvia arrived. The contrast was jarring. The glamorous, aggressive woman from the hotel ballroom was gone. Sylvia's dark hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, the roots showing a stark line of gray. Her nails, which had scraped Beatrice's cheek, were chipped and bitten down to the quick. She wore a plain gray sweater and looked physically ill. Sylvia sat at the far end of the table, leaving 3 empty chairs between herself and Dominic. The moment she sat down, she glared at him with a hatred so pure and venomous it practically vibrated in the sterile air. Dominic caught the look and scowled, his upper lip curling. "Don't look at me like that. You spent the money." "You told me it was a bonus," Sylvia hissed, her voice cracking. She slammed her hand flat on the table, making the cheap lawyer flinch. "You said you were making, partner. You lied to me, you pathetic piece of shit." "I bought you diamond earrings," Dominic yelled back, his face flushing an ugly mottled red. "You didn't ask where the money came from when you were drinking $300 champagne at the St. Regis, did you?" Beatrice sat perfectly still, watching the meat grinder at work. This was the grand romance that had destroyed her marriage. 2 rats trapped in a sinking barrel, immediately turning to cannibalism to survive. It was pathetic. The smell of their mutual panic and hostility was suffocating. Thomas, the litigator, cleared his throat. It was a sharp, grating sound that cut through their bickering. He opened a thick leather binder. "If we could proceed," Thomas said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "Mr. Cole, Miss Rossi, we are here to discuss the civil suit regarding the embezzlement of $420,000 from Apex Solutions, a subsidiary of the Gallagher Group." Dominic's lawyer leaned forward, wiping his forehead with a crumpled tissue. "My client is prepared to admit to a lapse in judgment regarding expense reporting. We are offering a repayment plan in exchange for dropping the criminal referral." Thomas didn't even look at the lawyer. He kept his eyes on the paperwork. "A repayment plan? With what assets? Mr. Cole's bank accounts are empty. His property is leased. His vehicle is financed. He has a net worth of negative $40,000. Dominic grabbed the edge of the table. He finally forced himself to look down the length of the polished wood at Beatrice. His eyes were wet, swimming with a mixture of terror and pleading. "B," Dominic whispered. The room was so quiet, the sound of the fluorescent bulbs seemed to roar. "B, please. They're going to send me to prison. Over expenses. Everybody fudges expenses." Beatrice let the silence stretch. She looked at his face, trying to find the man she had loved, the man she had made excuses for. He wasn't there. Maybe he never was. He was just an empty vessel of ambition and cowardice. "You didn't fudge expenses, Dominic," Beatrice said. Her voice was calm, conversational, lacking any of the heat he expected. "You stole from my grandfather's company to finance an affair with a subordinate. You used my family's money to buy her silence, and then you used my face as a punching bag when she got drunk." Sylvia flinched, shrinking down in her chair. "We are prepared to settle," Thomas interrupted smoothly, sliding 2 thick packets of paper across the table. One stopped in front of Dominic, the other in front of Sylvia. "The Gallagher Group will drop the criminal referral to the district attorney. You will avoid prison time." Dominic let out a shuddering, gasping breath, slumping forward as if his strings had been cut. "Oh, God. Thank you. B. Thank you." In exchange, Thomas continued, his tone turning to ice. "You will both sign these documents. They are confessions of gross financial fraud. You will accept a lifetime ban from holding any managerial or financial position in the corporate sector. You will surrender all remaining assets, including your 401ks, to the Gallagher Group as partial restitution. You will leave this room with the clothes on your backs and absolutely nothing else." Sylvia stared at the paper, tears finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her makeup. "I'll be bankrupt. I won't be able to get a job anywhere but retail." Beatrice stood up. The chair scraped against the carpet. She walked slowly down the side of the table, stopping behind Dominic. He smelled of fear and sour coffee. She leaned down, her mouth an inch from his ear. "Sign the paper, Dominic," she whispered. He picked up the cheap plastic pen his lawyer offered him. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely grip it. He pressed the nib to the paper, leaving a jagged, messy signature. Sylvia, sobbing quietly into her hands, signed hers a moment later. Beatrice didn't smile. She didn't feel triumphant. She just felt clean. The tumor had been excised. The infection was gone. "Thomas," Beatrice said, turning away from the table and walking toward the heavy walnut door. "File the bankruptcy paperwork and have security escort them out through the service elevator. I don't want them in the main lobby." She didn't look back as the door clicked shut behind her, sealing them in their own ruin. 3 months later, the air in the Grand Hotel's ballroom tasted entirely different. The cloying scent of roasted tenderloin and cheap Prosecco was gone. Instead, the cavernous space smelled of imported white orchids, dry vintage champagne, and the sharp electric tang of massive accumulated wealth. The annual Gallagher Shareholder Gala was not a party. It was a demonstration of force. Beatrice stood in the shadows of the velvet drapery near the main entrance, watching the room. The bruising on her face was long gone, leaving her pale skin flawless and cold. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, custom-made in Milan, that clung to her frame like liquid glass. The fabric was heavy, pulling at her shoulders, a constant physical reminder of the armor she now wore. Around her neck sat the Gallagher diamond, a vulgar, heavy stone her grandfather had bought during a hostile takeover in the 80s. It felt like a chain. Alistair stepped up beside her. He looked exactly the same, his slate eyes scanning the crowd of billionaires, politicians and media moguls milling about the floor. "Preston and Camilla have officially finalized the transfer of their voting shares," Alistair murmured, his voice barely audible over the low thrum of classical strings, Fee playing from the balcony. "They are currently residing in a villa in Tuscany. They will not return to the States." "Good," Beatrice said. She ran a finger over the smooth surface of her champagne flute. "And the logistics division? Profits are up 12%. Hale is managing it passably, though he remains terrified of you." Alistair glanced at her. "As he should be." Beatrice looked out at the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. She recognized the faces of men who could destroy economies with a phone call, women who owned entire zip codes. They were drinking her liquor. They were waiting for her. She remembered standing in this exact room in a cheap polyester dress, feeling the burning sting of a manicured hand across her face. She remembered the silence of the crowd, the averted eyes, the crushing, humiliating weight of being a nobody in a room full of people who thought they were somebodies. That Beatrice was dead. The woman who had ironed Dominic's shirts and clipped coupons was buried under a mountain of legal filings and offshore accounts. "It's time, Miss Gallagher," Alistair said gently. Beatrice handed him her glass. She took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold air fill her lungs. She stepped out from the shadows of the velvet drapes. The effect was instantaneous. It wasn't a sudden silence, but a rapid, cascading hush that rippled across the massive ballroom. The string quartet in the balcony faltered for a half-second before correcting their tempo. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses were lowered. Hundreds of heads turned. The elite, the ruthless, the untouchable, they all stopped to look at the woman who had returned from the dead to violently reclaim a trillion-dollar empire. Beatrice didn't smile. She didn't wave. She walked. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor. The sound was sharp, rhythmic, and echoing. As she moved toward the center of the room, the crowd physically parted. Men who commanded armies of lawyers stepped backward, pressing themselves against cocktail tables to give her a wide berth. Women draped in fortunes lowered their eyes as she passed. It wasn't respect. It was fear, pure, unadulterated fear of the apex predator stepping back into the territory. She reached the center of the room, the exact spot where Sylvia had struck her. She stopped. The entire ballroom held its breath. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from 1,000 anxious heartbeats. Beatrice looked around the room. She saw the nervous sweat beading on a senator's forehead. She saw the tremor in a rival CEO's hand as he held his drink. She felt the staggering, incomprehensible weight of the power she held in her hands. She had wanted to run from this. She had wanted a simple life with a simple man, believing that avoiding power was the same as being a good person. But Dominic had taught her the ultimate, cynical truth. Weakness doesn't make you good. It just makes you a victim. And Beatrice Gallagher was done being a victim. She raised her chin. The heavy diamond at her throat caught the chandelier light, fracturing it into 100 blinding shards. "Welcome," Beatrice said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence, it carried to the furthest corners of the room. It was cold, precise, and entirely devoid of mercy. "The Gallagher Group thanks you for your attendance. We have much to do." As she spoke, a rival hedge fund manager in the front row subtly bowed his head. Then another. Then the senator. A physical, undeniable yielding. The empire wasn't just kneeling, it was holding its breath, waiting for her command. Beatrice looked out over the bowed heads, feeling the cold, dark satisfaction settle into her bones. The bruised, quiet wife was gone forever. The monster had returned, and she found that the throne fit her perfectly. Vengeance isn't fire, it's ice. Beatrice didn't just break her cheating husband, she erased his entire existence, proving that real power doesn't scream, it whispers. If you felt the chill of that boardroom justice, and if you believe that nobody should ever have to shrink themselves to fit into someone else's mediocre life, hit the like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their own hidden strength, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more raw, grounded stories of betrayal, survival, and absolute dominance. See you in the next one.